remember those church bylaws that we passed last week? I think we need to add another note in there, and that is, from henceforth forevermore, song leaders can only take 1 week vacation. So if you sign up as song leader, you're stuck here for a long time. Earlier in this class, we had looked briefly at a study of the original languages. That's been several years ago. We looked at a message in Hebrew, a message on Aramaic, a message on Greek, and since that time, of course, we've even done an introductory study in Hebrew. One thing we learned from our study, just brief study of languages earlier in this class, was the following, that we have no autographs left. Of course, that's common knowledge here, but it's a common misunderstanding and misinterpretation of things you hear so many times said, either from the pulpit or from the lay audience out there. I've heard it from the pulpit just numerous times where someone is going to go home and check the original manuscripts, or they say that the original manuscripts had such and such. And the fact of the matter is nobody knows exactly what the original manuscripts had. So we don't have autographs, but what we do have are copies of the autographs. Of course, we would really say copies of the copies of the copies, and how far we would go there we don't know, of the autographs, because it was stated back at the very beginning that copies were to be made. For instance, in Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 and 19, well, really it runs from 14 through 20 here. I'm just picking out a couple of verses on the requirements for a future king in Israel. In Deuteronomy 17, one of the requirements there in verse 18 was that a copy of the law was to be made. And by the way, if you remember Old Testament introduction and a study of Deuteronomy and the origin of the term, it came from a misunderstanding and a mistranslation of the term copy of the law as a repetition, a repeat of the law. And that's where we get our name Deuteronomy, which simply means a repetition. It just so happens, though, they weren't thinking this, but it just so happens that Deuteronomy, in some sense of the word, is a repetition of the law. Over a period of about a month, Moses preaches 3 sermons, remember, on the plains of Moab, just prior to going into the Promised Land. And this is what the book of Deuteronomy is. It just so happens that it's a repetition. So we're stuck with that name. Of course, the Hebrews generally take the name from the first word or the first few words in a book. But anyway, verse 18, "And it shall come to pass, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write," of course he wouldn't have to do it immediately, but immediately, that is through a scribe or through someone else, he shall have written for him a copy of this law in a scroll, out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. That, of course, would be the original copy, technically known as the autograph of Moses here. And then, remember, there were certain temple or synagogal copies that were counted to be better, more accurate than other copies, and so whenever the autograph passed away as such, then a copy would have been made already by the Levites, by the priests. That would be the official copy in Israel. That would be stored in the tabernacle in the temple or some chief synagogue somewhere. As long as the temple or the tabernacle were standing, then probably it would be located there. Definitely it would be located there. Why not? Since that's the center of religious affection in Israel. And then he would make a copy of the official copy, or would have a copy made of the official copy. Verse 19, "And it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and to keep all the words of this law and these statutes to do them." Now, of course, we know that most of the kings didn't do that. As a matter of fact, we know none of the kings did that perfectly, because if they would have copied the law, one passage they would have ended up with would have been Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to 20. Why do I say that? Well, notice some of the prohibitions of verse 17. "Neither shall he multiply wives to himself." Well, we know the chief culprit who failed in that area. He should have had a copy of the law written and read the copy of the law, or the copy of the law. "That his heart turn not away," and we know Solomon's did. "Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold." We know Solomon did. In verse 16, "Don't have many horses, chariots." We know that Solomon did, and other kings did. So they weren't really obeying the copy, or reading the copy, or having the copy of the law read to them. No autographs, but there's the provision. That's the earliest notation that we have. Deuteronomy 17:18. The earliest notation that we have of the provision being made for the passing off the scene of the autographs. We've suggested the reason before, and there's probably not a better suggestion, that the reason God allowed the autographs to pass off the scene was simply so people don't venerate them today. Because your faith would be in that papyrus or that parchment scroll and not in the letters, the Word of God in the scroll. Then over in 2 Kings 22 and verse 8, the Reformation happening during the time of Josiah, 2 Kings 22 and verse 8, one thing that's discovered is the book of the law. No one really knows, and it can't be proven from the passage, the extent of this phrase, book of the law. Does he mean the law, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, or Deuteronomy, more technically is known as the law, because it's kind of a summation of the law, a repeat plus addition plus subtraction, but an essential repeat of the law, or the so-called book of the covenant that starts back in Exodus chapter 24. Even more technically, that's probably known as the book of the law, because it's called there in Exodus 24 the book of the covenant. And Jesus, in instituting the communion service in the Gospels, has reference there to the Old Covenant and to the New Covenant. The Old Covenant is established there in Exodus chapter 24. So just what of those three, probably one of those, we don't know which one we are to take from this, we don't know. But one thing we do know is it's some portion of the law. And it certainly is not an extant autograph. It's a copy of a copy of a copy. But it's probably an official one since it's here in the temple. And Hilkiah the high priest said unto Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. Now, I don't know exactly what your conception of the Old Testament temple might be, but I think most people's conception could be better termed a misconception, because they think of it maybe like a rectangular room like this, pretty much bare. And they don't take into account, all of the storehouses that you have to have for the various grains and the offerings that are brought in, and where the priests and Levites can live, and where they can have changes of garment because they had to wear certain clothes whenever they officiated at the temple or the tabernacle or on a holy day or something. It was a huge complex, So people think, I know I used to think whenever I read this, well, if it was a little room, 15 by 15 or 30 by 30, how could you misplace the Lord's law? How could that be misplaced in a little room like that? I couldn't lose a Bible in my house, and we've got several rooms there. And just in the little old temple, how could you misplace? Well, if it takes up a whole city block or something, the precincts and all of the porticos and so forth, well, it'd be easy to misplace this and be underneath some ancient robes that are underneath some piles of grain that are underneath some outdated utensils that are just worn out by the law of entropy there in the temple or something. And so Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. So there are provisions made for the copies of the law, Deuteronomy 17, and here is a case. There's no doubt about it. We probably don't have the autograph here of a copy of the copy, but we don't even have whatever book was discovered here in 2 Kings 22:8. And that's a long way removed from Deuteronomy 17 in the time of Moses and the autographs. But what we do have are copies of the copies. Eventually, however, just making copies of the copies, that was not enough, because the need arose to actually take the Bible into an entirely different language. And this brings us to what our studies are here in the introductory aspect of it, and that is the subject of Bible translations. Now, I hope to be able this evening, in either one long or two medium messages, that's another bylaw, no messages over 59.5 minutes, or maybe do two of them so that you get by your bylaws. Or he could resign as song leader for a week and then go on vacation, then resume it whenever he comes back. I guess there's some way to get around bylaws. But I hope this evening to wrap up just what I want to say in the introduction to study of Bible translations, which means, Lord willing, next week or whenever we're back to Biblical Lit. Remember, we weren't here last week. It's been 2 weeks ago on a Friday night since we were here. And that night we did 3 messages, so we made up for the night that we missed. Starting the next time, whenever we come back to Biblical Lit, we'll have a whole lot of historical material to go into. We're just setting the scene, just the introduction to Bible translations. And then we're going to start going step by step, century by century of Bible translations up into present times. Of course, we've already alerted you to, Weiss translation and the NIV and various translations, but we haven't said a whole lot about them except for a few introductory remarks. Now, what I want to do is look at some important terms, or some terms of importance, whichever way you want to look at it, about a half a dozen or so, and make some technical distinctions here between certain terms, and in doing this we'll do some more explaining and some more introducing this whole area of Bible translation. So first of all, let's start with the term translation. What actually are we talking about with the term of translation? Translation, version. Is there a difference between a translation and a version? Well, in one sense of the word there is. So although we might use these terms loosely, a translation, a version, the King James Version, is it a King James Version or is it a King James translation? Or is there a difference? Or is it a King James recension, and it should be the KJR instead of KJT or KJV? Well, you'll see what I mean as we go along. Translation, a definition of translation. You could probably give this yourself, but I'll have to give this before we can go on to others. The rendering of a work from one language to another. Notice how general that is. The rendering of a work from one language to another. Notice I did not say from the original language to the receptor language. And that is a distinction that we have to make. The rendering of a work from one language to another. Very simplified. But it can be according to two different topics. So 1A, according to procedure. And then we'll look in a moment, you don't have to write it down because it'll mess up your notes, but B will be according to language. According to procedure. A translation is the rendering of a work from one language to another. In the first place, we're going to look at the subject of according to procedure. What do we mean here? This is what we discussed 2 weeks ago on a Friday night. In those messages where we looked at the literal, the free, and the dynamic equivalent translations. Now this is extremely, extremely important, and we're not just reviewing because I want you to hear it again, but we're going to review because I'm going to say a few more things that I did not have the time to say, even though I had a lot of time to talk that night. I didn't say everything that I wanted to. Now, some of you have already commented over the last couple of weeks since those messages, or that evening together. It's given you new insight into Bible translations and helped to clear up the cobwebs in your mind over being a staunch KJV supporter or whatever. Now, I actually had one brother who said, I really thought it was going to be KJV forever, even with all of these hints that I've been making and alluding to this, that, or the other. Sometimes you find out allusions are not enough. People have to hear exactly what it is they have to hear, or they just think, well, probably he's either baiting us or trying to trick us, one or the other there. Maybe it's a combination of those. And so we're really not to believe that. But he said, I would look down on others with disdain whenever I would see them carrying another translation. He would notice other people in other churches, or you'd go to a bookstore, a Bible bookstore, and you'd see all these, Tower of Babel, look at these translations in here. What you need is Paul's Bible, the KJV. Now, he didn't really believe that, but I mean, that's the mentality that you're in. Is the KJV is really the best, and it's the best for numerous reasons. Well, we've dislodged that notion from your mind, but we're going to emphasize some more of this again because it is extremely, extremely important to know the differences and to understand, to be able to comprehend, hopefully to be able to communicate to others the difference between these paraphrastic, these free translations, those that are literal, those that are woody, the same thing, and those that are free, or those that are smooth, rather, or sense translations, something that fits in between. That Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, we used some of their material last time, referred to it as a dynamic equivalent, which is just a big term to say probably, well, I call it a sense translation. That's what I called it then. So according to procedure, this then goes back to our theory, or our theory of translation, but particularly the last aspect of that, and that is our philosophy of communication. So I want to go over that again this evening. It's very important because the Bible that you use, let me rephrase that. Not necessarily the Bible that you use, but the idea that you have that causes you to use the Bible that you have will greatly influence your theology. I mean, the Bible itself influences your theology. If you use a KJV and your mind is stuck in that pattern, you'll have a KJV theology. Not just because you use the KJV, because we can be using it as we are right now and still not end up with a KJV theology because our mind is different. Our mind thinks something different about the KJV than what most people would think. But, of course, Dr. Freeman in Faith Assembly is a good example. They don't only use the KJV, but it's a mindset for them. It's a rut they're in, the KJV. And what Bible you use and or the reason that dictates you using the Bible that you use is going to profoundly influence one's theology. And you'll see more of what I mean by that as we go along tonight. So we've got, according to procedure, we've got 3 different procedures: the literal translation, the free translation, or the sense translation. Remember in our theory of translation, that's what we've been working on for many, many messages now, a theory of translation. If it was just so easy that we could just pick a Bible, we just would, do what everyone else does and pick KJV, but it's not that easy. You have to understand reasons behind and the procedure behind translations, what exactly goes into a translation. So we said there with our theory of translation that it's the translation and your theory, it's dependent upon 3 things: the accuracy of the underlying text, the skill of the translators, and your philosophy of communication. We've labored this a lot. We're only going to be on that last point again, though. The accuracy of the underlying text. Bad translation comes from inferior text. That only makes sense. The skill of the translators. Kenneth Taylor was not a skilled linguist, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic scholar. Hence we have the LB, the Living Bible. The skill of the translator. And we discussed that. Should it be an individual versus a committee, national versus international, denominational versus non versus interdenominational, and so forth? And the most important thing of all of that, though, is the philosophy of communication. You could have, if you had bad text, you could have a good philosophy of communication and you'd still end up with a poor translation. But the converse is true as well. You could have a good underlying text, but a poor philosophy of communication, and you'll end up with an inferior translation as a result of that. We define philosophy of communication as follows. This is all technical, but as long as you can get this worked in your mind, then you are root and branch, this KJV mentality, or whatever version you're using, whatever translation you're using, is rooted out as being the right translation, or the holy one, or the best one, or the perfect one. Because they all, without exception, they all have their shortcomings. They all have many shortcomings. Every single translation that you will ever use is not only a translation, but it is an interpretation of what whoever translated that translation thinks that God meant by what he said in whatever manuscript that they're using. Freeman is always saying, away with interpretation. He said, away with commentaries. We just need the Bible. Just stay with the Bible. The Bible, whatever translation you use, is a commentary. In some part, it's a commentary. In some part, it's a man's interpretation of how should that word fit in this context. Away with these mechanical notions that if the word is B-A-T in Hebrew, bat, then whenever we go over to English, every time it's going to be B-A-T in English as well. That just does not work at all. That does not work in any translation. You are influenced by the context. You're influenced by your theological understanding of the context, where that word or that verse is found, and that will depend how you're going to translate that word on that occasion. And so Freeman has the most naive lay understanding when he says we don't need men's interpretations, just get the Bible out and read it and believe what it says, and what it says is what it means, and we don't need men's interpretations. Every and any translation, don't ever forget, is a mixture of translation and interpretation. And if you say, well, I don't like that, so I'm going to learn Hebrew and Greek and I'm just going to do a translation. It's impossible. It's impossible. Your theological bias, for the better or for the worse, be it good or be it evil, your theological prejudice and bias will influence your version. There's no way around it. It's impossible to get around that. You say, well, if I could just read Hebrew and Greek, then I wouldn't try to translate. I'd just stay with that. But you're going to be reading things into the passage, though. A passage that says something, and because of the way that you've been brought up historically, educationally, financially, sociologically, culturally, it's going to influence the way you understand that passage. Of course, what you say, well, how can we get away from that? Well, A, you really can't. You just can't. But B, you don't just surrender and say you can't. B, you make as many safeguards as possible. And the best way to do that is to listen to all the various opinions that exist about something, or the chief and the major ones, and then try to decide from looking at them. Otherwise, you end up with a very narrow, biased view of everything. You're reading all of these chapters, the whole Bible, all the books in the Bible, from a certain single point of view. Good case example, the way people in the faith movement read the Bible. They read it with a prejudice or a bias toward the miraculous and toward faith. Or a charismatic, he reads it with a bias toward speaking in tongues and the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And he reads it with a bias of magic, looking for magic, looking just anything that the Baptists don't believe, I'm sure it's in the Bible. And then sure enough, you find axe heads floating and all types of things there. And then you try to go out and do that on your own. So you say, well, we're not going to be reading it from that. Well, we're going to be reading it now from an anti-faith movement perspective. And what happens? Then you almost tend to water down those strong faith promises, those strong faith passages there. That's why we're always trying to balance. We have to go over here and say, now this is not right, and over here, and that's not right, but let's make sure we realize both of these things are out there, or we're going to fall for one of them. If we know what's out there, then we can look for a balance in between and take the good that exists in both camps. And good generally exists in any and every camp, even if it's a false religious cult. There's something that they have gotten hung up on that probably has a measure of truth in it. Probably something that no other religious sect is emphasizing. And so they have taken it and overemphasized it then. It's not that we're advocating having a gray ministry, but people that always try to just have, just one color, a black ministry, they just major on their passages and on their text. That's why I said in some of those recent faith movement messages, we really can't have a favorite book of the Bible, a favorite chapter of the Bible, a favorite verse of the Bible, a favorite theme of the Bible, a favorite personality besides Jesus or God of the Bible. You really can't. You get Paul, and all of a sudden Paul is the man who never sinned, who's totally holy, and Peter, Jude, and James and the rest are just not as good as Paul. It's because you're majoring on Paul. Or the Catholics, Peter, and you just major on Peter. And then what happens? Then you have a problem whenever you run across a text that's contrary to your bias then. Peter denied Jesus. That's a difficult passage for the Catholics to handle then. Well, that was before really the church began. Okay, afterwards, Galatians 2, Paul rebuked him because of his inconsistency in his Christian life. Well, that's a difficult passage to handle then as a Roman Catholic. Peter was wrong and Paul was right. And so Paul is the perfect one. Romans 7, that which I want to do, I don't do, and that which I don't want to do, I do. Now you're going to run into problems with Paul and his life and theology there. Anytime you try to pick out this is the best or the favorite, such as faith is the most important thing in all of the Bible. It's the chief thing, and what they mean by that's the only thing with which God is concerned today. Then what happens? You see faith. Everywhere you look, you see faith. And whenever it talks about love, you say, well, love is basically weakness. That's how you interpret the bit. And love is strong. The love of the Bible is strong. The love of the Bible is a redeeming love, a reconciling love. But what you see of love is compromise. Love is compromise. And instead of compromising, we have to have strong faith doctrine is what we have to have. And so you end up running into a passage where Paul says, love is greater than faith, and you say, but that's really not true, because this is true over here. You run into a passage that contradicts. You pick any subject you want and make that your favorite one, and you'll run into problems in the Bible then. There'll be a passage somewhere that does something to your little doctrine. You say, well, it doesn't seem like we can come to conclusions. Yes, we can if we'll take all of it together. Amen. And not zero in on one thing and say this is really the only significant thing. Because we know there are people that zero in on the sickness passages and end up with a sickness theology then. And they have problems with James 5 then. And we have people that zero in on healing passages, and of course they have problems with some of these sickness passages, and they all invent little neat ways, little schemes or systems, prepackaged formulas to escape the problem of having to look at a text honestly. So anyway, our philosophy of communication, the degree of willingness, you can either write it down or if you've got your other notes, you can kind of review that. The philosophy of communication, this is adopted by everyone. You have to have some philosophy of how you're going to communicate God's Word in the receptor language. But your degree of willingness to bridge these gaps is what makes all the difference in the world, in the quality of the translation. The degree of willingness to bridge the historical, cultural, and linguistic gap. You can either think of those in the singular or you can think of them in the plural, gaps. There's a historical gap, a cultural gap, and a linguistic gap. Or it's just one huge gap that we have to face. We are basically white, Anglo-Saxon, American, English-speaking Christian of the 20th century, the age of computers, and we're trying to read something about Abraham and goat milk. They drank goat milk back then. And we have pasteurized, homogenized cow's milk. I mean, just the difference in the culture and the time and everything. And then we think we're really an authority on goats or Abraham or something. And we're living 4,000 years this side of him. That's why people like Freemanite followers, they just have such a hatred because they've never been able to really sit down and wisely consider and identify with people on the other side of the coin. That's why the liberals have ended up with some of the positions that they have. What they say is the Bible is not really God's Word, but it contains good ideas in it. Because think, how can that Word, 4,000 years old, really be applicable for today? Then you have to get into the areas, well, it is applicable, but only parts of it. So which parts are applicable to today? Then you're into the hermeneutical problem, which some people say, well, you're back to liberalism then. Freeman says just take the whole Bible just for what it says. Well, we do that. We take it for just for what it says, but then we have to gain some type of understanding of that. And I can, it's not that we're in agreement with liberals, but I know in my life I come to a place where I can sympathize much more readily with someone like that. Because I look at those miracles. And I've said before in some of those faith message teachings that the typical conservative charismatic wants to read more of the miraculous element into the Bible than really exists. There's plenty there. Just leave it like it is. There's plenty of miracles there. But they're wanting to read more into that than really exists. The occasions of Jesus passing, this is the case that I've given you recently, passing through the midst of people like in Luke 4, whenever they tried to throw him off the brow of the hill. And what we conservative charismatics see is he became invisible. Well, it doesn't say that he became invisible. It doesn't say that at all. We can read, and charismatics are prone to do this. We read more of the miraculous element into that than really exists. If we read, you think of your past life, hopefully you're getting more and more delivered from that. If you read in a commentary that what the plagues were in Egypt, you see, I read this all the time. They really weren't miracles, but they were a miraculous heightening of existing current events then. And we like to think that's not true. The locusts probably lived in Antarctica, and it was so miraculous God brought them from Antarctica all the way to Egypt there. No, Egypt periodically experienced devastating locust plagues. And so it just so happens that God intensifies that, and it all is concurrent with that 9 months or 12-month period, however long the plagues are going on there. We don't like to hear that. I say we conservative charismatics, lay charismatics, don't like to hear that. We don't like to hear that Egypt has ever been devastated by a plague of locusts prior to the book of Exodus. Why? Because then we think, well, it wasn't a miracle after all then. In one sense, it wasn't. The sense where it was a miracle was the timing of it as well as the heightening of it. It had never been devastated since its day of foundation to the extent that it was during that period of time. the water in the Nile turning, well, the Bible says to blood. Does it mean just red? Well, during certain times of the year, it has a tint of red in it. You see, the liberals know all of this. They know about all of this type of stuff. And it just turns red naturally. And so you got a problem there. Frogs coming out of the river. That happens periodically whenever the Nile floods its banks. Whenever it floods over, frogs come out and they're seeking a place and they head into the homes of the people on the banks. No miracles in. And we say, get rid of that liberal scholar. He's taking all of the miraculous element out of the Bible. Not necessarily. Not necessarily at all. And then they go too far. Jesus walking on the water, well, really there was a sandbar out there that he was walking on. Then they try to explain every miraculous element away. Or he knew that there was an old forest there, and there were some stumps out in the water. And he knew where that forest was from a boy, and so he walked on the remains of the tree stumps there. Well, you're really stretching it to start explaining things like that.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape over.
And here's the problem. I'm giving you a whole lesson in a lot of things right now. Here's the problem. Where that will lead a person, if you stay with that liberal mentality, is you'll deny the resurrection and the virgin birth.
Amen.
You'll have to deny that. No one can be raised. Once you're dead, you're dead. You're just dead. No one is born without a man and a woman coming together in marital relations. That is biologically impossible. Is that not true? That is true. It's biologically impossible. But God is the God of the impossible, though. So you have to know when to read into the account there something else that was just existing at that time, and when not to read anything into it, but let the miracle stand as a miracle. The case with Elijah fishing out the axe head, remember, that we've discussed? Now there was significance, prophetic, cultural significance behind that. We've explained that in an earlier message recently. But the liberal could go beyond just explaining that. You start by explaining how it was borrowed and the prophets were poor, and then if you didn't get that back, you could be sold as a slave, and that prophet or the son of the prophet would end his ministry for a year or two. And so it wasn't just a miracle because God didn't have anything better to do that day. It was something vitally important for the sons of the prophets to have that axe head lifted up. And so a liberal scholar will give that to you, and all of that's just and right and true and fine. But what he's sometimes intending is then for you to start thinking about that, thinking, okay, so it wasn't just an out of the blue, off the tip of God's head type of miracle. It had a reason behind it. Well, maybe it wasn't a miracle after all then. Maybe there was a sudden undercurrent and then an upcurrent that brought it up from the bottom just as Elisha was bending over to bring it up. And so then we don't have a miracle, just the water changed down at the bottom of the river and brought the thing up. And then a conservative might say, well, maybe that is what happened. I mean, God didn't actually with his hand reach down there and bring it up. What was the physical or mechanical cause that lifted the axe head from the bottom to the top? Maybe it was a current of water. But maybe it was the Lord who sent the current of water and caused it to lift it up. A conservative would reason that way. Then, of course, you have to go a step further. What caused the current of water then? I mean, if we're not going to allow God just to immediately do something, everything has to be immediately done, what caused the current of water? Well, maybe a big fish jumped and splashed the water and it brought a current in it. Well, what caused the fish to splash at that time then? And then you're going to have to go back to, in the beginning there was God and nothing else, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning there was God. Well, then how did the worlds come into being? That's why it's one of the proofs of faith over there in Hebrews 11. Because you can't go any earlier than that. If we keep trying to go earlier, we're going to run into problems. Well, anyway, we'll get into that in apologetics. The degree of willingness to bridge the historical, cultural, and linguistic gap between the original and receptor languages. Now, the hyper-conservative charismatic doesn't want to bridge any gaps. He says just leave the Bible alone. We left it alone, we'd have nothing to read because it'd be back in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. But he says just leave it alone. Let the Word speak for itself. Just believe it literally and take it for face value for what it says. Well, we could end up with a lot of problems. The degree of willingness to bridge the historical, cultural, linguistic gaps between the original and the receptor languages. Different committees or single individuals of translators adopt a different philosophy of communication. That is, their degree of willingness to bridge these gaps varies considerably, thus giving us our different types of translations. And we put this up on the board, and I want to show it to you again. We don't put all the versions, or we can't really here. Over here would be literal. There are different degrees of willingness to bridge those gaps and help us understand. Some people don't want to help us understand at all. Sometimes it's because of a superficial, sacred reverence for the Bible. We don't want to make it more relevant than it was at that time. And that's pious. It's probably superficially sacred, though, because of the fact we're removed by thousands of years of history and culture and everything else. In the middle we have a sense translation, or according to Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, two professors down at Gordon Conwell, they call it a dynamic equivalent. A dynamic equivalent translation. And then over here we have our three ones. Now there are some that are extreme in either direction. Off the board over here, I think we gave you one man's translation of 1 Corinthians 5:1, where the man hath the wife of the father. There are whoredoms that have not been named before, just extreme in the area of being literal. But the recognized ones here are the KJV and NAS, New American Standard Bible, are very literal translations. This is all in your notes from last week, but it won't hurt to write it again just to help you remember this. The KJV and the NAS Bibles are very literal. King James is very literal. As I quoted one other professor, his I think it was Gordon Fee, as a matter of fact, his view of the NASB is that is English in English as it was never spoken by anyone before. And I've read the NASB, and I have to agree, no one talks in the English of the NASB. You say, well, no one does in KJV. Well, they used to, though. And his point is no one has ever spoken in the NASB English. And I agree. It is so very woody and sticky. But it's a good Bible to have because, we explained this last time, because it is so literal, it helps you to see what the Hebrew or the Greek thought there was, because they're trying to go word for word for word, phrase for phrase, sentence structure the same, grammar, syntax the same. And you say, well, is there anything wrong with that? Well, that depends on what philosophy of communication you're going to adopt. If you like that philosophy, this is the type of Bible to translate, and this is the type of Bible to use it, because you'll certainly have one that fits that. Halfway in between literal and a dynamic equivalent is the RSV. Now, the RSV, I said, I think before, that it's been a very popular Bible, but never among evangelicals. It's only been a popular Bible in liturgical churches. However, it's a good translation in the sense that it kind of helps bridge between these literal ones here and getting right over to a good dynamic equivalent. I've got the RSV, and it's good in that sense. But of course, we've already talked about its problems before, 2 Timothy 3, and other passages that would have problems with the RSV. It does seem to have a liberal slant. There's no doubt about that. Then we get over here, and we have Bibles like the NAV and the NIV, the New American Bible, translated by the best of American Catholic scholarship, and the New International Version, best of evangelical scholarship in the world today. And this is a little bit towards the literal, but it's still a dynamic equivalent. And under dynamic equivalent, but on the heading toward the free side, would be something like, Jerusalem. JB, the Jerusalem Bible. I think another one we had up here was a New English Bible. Jerusalem Bible is just a translation of the French Jerusalem Bible. The NAB, the New English Bible, is a British Bible. It's difficult to read because it's filled with British idiom. Halfway between the dynamic equivalent and the free would be something like Phillips. Phillips translation is a good one to have. Phillips translation. Then a free translation, the most popular, would be the Living Bible, LB, the Living Bible. And of course, off the side on the free would be something like Jordan's Cotton Patch version that gives us the Epistle of Romans, the Epistle to Washington. The really free, contemporary American there, the Cotton Patch version. Okay, something like this is good to keep in your mind, even if you can't remember exactly which ones fit here. And we're going to go over so many translations. I don't even know that I can tell you where all of them fit on this scale, but we'll be able to know where the chief ones fit. There's so many minor ones that I'm not going to keep putting this scale up here and then trying to fit all of these hundreds and hundreds of versions underneath that. I'd have to have read all of them to know exactly where all of them fit. Okay, so we've got literal, that's word for word. This is generally what naive people like, Faith Assembly members, they like these literal, stiff, sticky ones, hyper-literalists from an evangelical, charismatic background, because they think that you're taking liberties with the text, you're tampering with God's Word to try to adapt the Bible to our society and to our culture. And of course, there are positive points in that. Let's don't play around with God's Word. This is something very, very serious here. Amen. But let's don't leave it so antiquated that it's no good. It won't help us at all if it's antiquated then. That will not help us at all. Then you've got the free people who, they like bedtime stories. I mean, they want a book that's on a third grade level to read. And the Living Bible is about, well, probably a little higher than that, but somewhere around that to read. The Living Bible, you can just sit there and read and read and read. Oh, I was happy today. Instead of, I had the joy of God today, it's, oh, I was happy today. Just like we would speak today. The common man would speak. That's probably not a good procedure to follow. Anyone, probably including Kenneth Taylor himself, the translator of the LB, although maybe I'm taking liberties with his point of view to suggest this, just about anyone who's trained and skilled would not be in favor of the habitual use of a free translation simply because it's not exact enough. It takes too many liberties with the text. And when it does that, then it can very clearly obscure the message of the Bible. That leaves us with, we're back to balance again, something in the middle. According to Fee and Stewart, a dynamic equivalent translation or a sense translation or a smooth translation. The NAB, the NIV, the JB, the NEB, the GNB, the TEV, other versions that would fit there. We have opted in the church for the NIV for the simple reason that it's becoming the end Bible of evangelical American Christianity. We lived in Japan and we spoke Japanese, we wouldn't use the NIV. So it's not like the NIV now replaces the KJV in our theology or mentality as the holiest of all versions. It's just what one will fit us as an American speaking English living in the 20th century. This fit people in Great Britain who spoke English who lived in the 17th century. Okay, it was fine for them. Fine for them with a few exceptions, like it's based on inferior manuscripts, but it's fine for them. For us today, 3.5 centuries after that, we live on a different continent on the other side of the Atlantic now, and we're still stuck with this. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we opt for what is, some people, a lot of college students opt for this NASB here because of its literal nature. They think that the more literal it is, the more guarantee we have that the Hebrew and the Greek are really coming out and coming across to us. That's not necessarily true. Sometimes it is true that the Hebrew and Greek are coming across to you so much that you don't even know the English then. All you're stuck with is some rigid formula here. So for all of the obvious reasons, we opt for the NIV. Let's go back and make sure we understand why we are surrendering the KJV. Let me suggest a few reasons that you probably could already deduce yourself by now why we are opting for the NIV over the KJV. Chief among all reasons, number one, is KJV is based on inferior manuscripts. All of the versions that we have up here, this was, I think, the clincher for some of you in believing that my desire to go to the NIV was a good thing to do. All of these versions we have up here, with the exception of KJV, all of these are based on the better and the older manuscripts. Why in the world stay with a version that is based upon inferior medieval manuscripts when we're always having to add to or subtract or change something there? The NASB is almost the counterpart. You almost have to have them together. The NASB is the counterpart to the KJV. They're going to read very similar. The English is updated somewhat in NAS, And better than that, it's based on the better manuscripts. And that's what makes the NASB really a better substitute for the KJV. Of course, the problem is this is English as English has never been spoken. The KJV is beautiful English as it was spoken in Elizabethan England. So it's based on inferior manuscripts. Secondly, it's an inconsistent translation. Okay, you say, what's new there? What translation isn't inconsistent? Well, you have a point there. The NIV is inconsistent. We've been showing that to you in other studies. So they're all inconsistent. So I guess we're talking about a certain measure of inconsistency here. It's tremendously insignificant. The KJV translators went by the premise, the more English synonyms we can gather out of our dictionaries for the self-same original Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek word, the better the diversity, therefore the better the translation will have. And we say the more confusion that you will have. They go by that premise, and that's not a very good premise to operate upon. The more synonyms possible, so we can add diversity. We want diversity. We don't want uniformity. We want diversity. The more synonyms we can have in our translation for the self-same original word, the better the clarity. We say the worse the clarity. So it's inconsistent to a large degree. And then thirdly, the KJV is culturally outdated. The KJV is culturally outdated. With all of its idioms, with all of its English. We gave you a verse over in Psalm 119 where the psalmist said that I prevented the dawning of the morning. We don't use the word prevent in that sense anymore. What do you mean? He stopped the morning from coming? No, it means that he woke up before dawn. Why don't you just give us he woke up before dawn instead of I prevented the dawning of the morning? It gives you a different connotation entirely. In other words, you have to kind of know what he means by that, and if you have to kind of be working with your own knowledge and read in and correct that, why not just go to a Bible that already has it all read in and corrected for you then? That only makes sense. It's used again, this prevent over in 1 Thessalonians 4. We probably changed that for you just in reading. 1 Thessalonians 4, you'll find the word prevent many times in King James, and it means just the reverse from what the term means today in American English. 1 Thessalonians 4 in verse 15. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not stop. Prevent means stop to us. So let's read that in. Shall not stop them which are asleep. Prevent them which are asleep. No, he means we won't go before those that are asleep, as he goes on to say in the next few verses here. So the word precede would be better than prevent. But to them, prevent's not a bad word. It was a perfect word for 1611 because it meant to them precede. But since prevent does not mean precede to us, we need precede there. That we which are alive and remain of the coming of the Lord shall not precede, shall not go before those that are asleep. Another famous passage using a different word, but 2 Thessalonians 2:7 is they gave us let, and what we need is prevent. We need to go back to prevent now because let and prevent mean just the opposite in English today as compared to 1611. The mystery of iniquity, or the mystery of lawlessness, doth already work. Only he who now letteth. Now we mean allow. If you let someone do something, you allow them. Only he who now allows will allow until he be taken out of the way. Well, it seems like he means he who will not allow until he's taken out of the way, and then he can't allow. So we need the word prevent. We need the prevent from 1 Thessalonians 4 lifted out and brought over here to 2 Thessalonians 2. Only he who now prevents will prevent until he be taken out of the way. So every time the King James using let or letteth or letting in that context or that sense, it means just the opposite. It doesn't mean allow, it means not to allow. And whenever it uses prevent, it means just the opposite. Not prevent, but to not prevent, like over in Psalm 119. So inferior manuscripts, it's inconsistent in its translation, and it's culturally outdated. chiefly we're showing what we mean by that last point just in the English that is used. The English is perfect and beautiful for the time for which it was meant. But if we've moved few things last 3.5 centuries. Generally, you've come up with something better and newer after 3.5 centuries. If we've come up with something better, and we certainly have, then we shouldn't have to bind ourselves to Elizabethan terminology. So we've got literal, which is word for word. We've got our smooth, our dynamic equivalent translation, our sense translation, which fits in between. We have our free, which also we could call maybe paraphrastic, because it's very much like a paraphrase. Now, back to the definition, and one other thing that I wanted to say before we kind of move beyond this. I didn't get to answer a question that someone asked. I think it was my wife that brought it up last week during the teaching. We said the degree of willingness to bridge the historical, cultural, and linguistic gap. Linguistic, that means we have to go from Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, syntax, and grammar to English and still have it make sense, or that is, really, to have it make sense for us today. What do we do here with a dynamic equivalent? Well, I said under dynamic equivalent, it keeps the historical distance. We've given you various cases, examples of that. I think the one that I gave you last time concerned the number of Israelites that came out of Egypt. Since we just know historically 3 million people can't survive in the Sinai, then we make it into thousands or hundreds, companies of people, so you end up with a few thousand or a few hundred people. Well, a good dynamic equivalent translation will not tamper with the historicity of events like that. Will not try to explain that what really happened in the resurrection of Christ was that he kind of fainted, and then the coolness of the tomb revived him. Liberal circles, it's known as the swoon theory of the resurrection. It will leave the historicity of events alone. So the historical gap has to remain there. The linguistic gap is bridged. The better it's bridged, the better. The better you can bring the sense, the meaning, a dynamic equivalent over into our thought pattern and our sentence structure, the better. Okay, all ears attuned now. What about the cultural gap? I said whenever I covered last time the dynamic equivalent that the cultural problem is just one of its own. And we would have to come back to it later. And I never had time then. We're going to look at it briefly now. This is probably one of the most difficult areas to deal with. We gave you some examples in the areas of weights and measures and money, in the area of sexual euphemisms. The business of sexual euphemisms is a business that really we can't get away from. We went through all of that, but you think about that. We could try to be not literal. Literal says that he covered his feet. That's literally what the Hebrew says, that he covered his feet. Well, since we don't use that, and they didn't really use that in 1611 either, we've got to bring it over so we can understand it. So can we use the word urine in the Bible? Or what about some of those other words that we looked at, more graphic than that? You're going to have to use a euphemism, basically, in so many areas. Adam knew his wife Eve. That's a sexual euphemism there. We don't use that. You'll even find that euphemism used like in newspapers or magazines, and they'll say as the King James Version means, because that's just become well known and popular throughout American culture, that to know your wife or to know your husband is a sexual euphemism. So what are we supposed to say? Culturally, things haven't changed. The culture doesn't dictate that act of marriage. That's been the same from the beginning of time up until now. So we can say that he slept with her. Well, one thing you do whenever you have the act of marriage, you're not asleep. So that's a euphemism, and it's a fairly good euphemism, but when it comes to describing what's going on, it's horrible. You hear that someone slept with someone, she slept with him. You'll hear about some junior female executive that she slept her way to the top. Well, she certainly wasn't asleep. That's not how she got to the top. Oh, what we mean is she went to bed with people. No, because sometimes you can do it out in the clover. So what are we going to say? She went to clovers with him? What are we going to say then? That's just a sexual euphemism. He went to bed with her. What do? They go to sleep when they got in bed? Did they argue when they got in bed? No, we mean something by that, do we not? So they had intercourse. Well, I'm having intercourse with you right now. So there we're back to a problem. The best thing to put in is sexual intercourse. Then we know what's going on. We don't want to be too scientific and say copulation. Who knows what copulation means? So let's don't talk about copulation. That's getting, too in a lab with a white coat on and everything's polished in there and you wear white gloves on your hands. That he copulated with his wife. Your child would be reading that and say, what is a copulation? So maybe sexual intercourse is better. Can we get away with reading that in church? Well, we should be able to. Especially in churches not like ours where no children are in there anyway. You've only got adults in there. Can we just say he had sex with her? That's about as low as you can go. That's what he really did. To say sexual intercourse, so that's saying the same thing, but intercourse and sexual just sounds a little bit more acceptable than just saying just plain out he had sex. We say he made love. How do you make love? Can you hold hands and make love? Well, that could be love. Could you write a letter and I'm making love? I'm writing a letter. Well, certainly so. What does that become? A sexual euphemism in American culture. See, this is fascinating when you study things like this. And you don't realize all these terms and phrases we're using, they're nothing but euphemisms. In other words, a euphemism can always bring up the problem of causing the person who's reading that or listening to totally miss the point. That's why we have to use something that is current today. Adam knew his wife. That is not a current sexual euphemism. Saul covered his feet. That is not a current sexual or toilet euphemism. That's not a current one. We're going to have to say restroom, bathroom, number one, number two, whatever you want to call it. That is a current. Of course, you're going to have to make sure that wasn't private in your family. Number one and number two, or whatever little jolly phrases you used. You may have coined some in your own family. And then you try to write a Bible and put that in there. Nobody knows what's going on. It'd be back to like covering your feet then. Covered his feet. And you think it's time to check into a motel and get in bed or something. Cover the feet. And you don't really know what's going on. So, well, it's an amusing area, but it's an area that's important because the Bible is dealing with things like this. And the KJV was trying to deal with it from the point of view of the puritanical stance of most people in 1611. And it's not that we are advocating the new morality of J.A.T. Robinson and Joseph Fletcher, the situation ethics and new morality, but we are in a freer culture, in a freer society today. We are not so much controlled by the puritanical standards that people were in England in 1611. So we don't have to use such a blase term or phrase as he knew his wife, because we all know many men's wives. We're not married to them. We know them in another sense by what you mean whenever you use that in Genesis 4:11. So culturally, let's look at a few examples. If you'll turn back to Genesis chapter 18. What I want to do next in this study is to, first of all, before we go into some other technical terms, we're still on translation from the last study, but to look at this cultural business. And I'm leading up to say some things, so you're going to have to follow carefully along. Genesis 18, I just want to give you a few examples from the Living Bible. Now, of course, the Living Bible tries to totally transcend this cultural gap. Any of your free translations are going to try to do away with the cultural gap and make everything just as down home, as relevant as possible. So Genesis 18, whatever version you have, read along. The Lord appeared again to Abraham while he was living in the oak grove at Mamre. And this is the way it happened. One hot summer afternoon. See, it just reads like we would read an English book today, and there's nothing wrong with that. As long as the Hebrew will let you say that. One hot summer afternoon. Remember, don't get these just, I hate that version idea, because it may be able to express things in a way that we talk today in America. We say that, one hot summer afternoon. What does the KJV say there?
In the heat of the day.
in the heat of the day. Well, we don't say in the heat of the day. We say one hot summer afternoon. So that's a better way to say it. One hot summer afternoon. As he was sitting in the opening of his tent, he suddenly noticed 3 men coming toward him. He sprang up and ran to meet them and welcome them. "Sirs," he said, "please don't go any further. Stop a while and rest here in the shade of this tree while I'll get water to refresh your feet and a bite to eat to strengthen you. Do stay a while before continuing your journey." As long as the Hebrew will allow this, it's perfectly good translation because it talked just like we talk today. "All right," they said. Now, you won't find that in the King James. "Okay, buddy." Oh, "all right. Do as you have said." We don't exactly talk like that. We just say, "Go ahead and do it." Then Abraham ran back to the tent and said to Sarah, "Quick, mix up some pancakes." Now, right there, well, you responded when you were supposed to.